Hello, bio students. As you can see, today we're going to be discussing trophic interactions. The major topics that we'll be looking at are the trophic structure that we find in an ecosystem. We'll be talking about biodiversity of an ecosystem, and then two important types of species within an ecosystem. First, keystone species, and then invasive species. The reading that you can find the content that we're discussing today is in chapter 13. And besides this video, there's one more required video, and that is found in Edpuzzle on keystone species. Your homework, obviously, is to watch the two videos and take notes. And then, as usual, you'll need to be posting those notes to the homework assignment. All right, let's go ahead and get started. And I want to start out with a bit of a review. In our last class, we talked about three types of community interactions. And if you can remember, hopefully you can remember, those were competition, symbiosis, and predation. The question we have here is related to competition specifically. And what we're going to look at here is what is the effect of competition on the species that are competing. So let's take a look. I'm going to quickly read the question, and then we'll stop and give you a chance to analyze it. So an investigation was carried out into the competition between two species of grass, Bromus madritensis and Bromus rigidus. Equal numbers of seeds of Bromus madritensis were sown in a number of different pots. In each pot, an equal number of seeds of rigidus was then sown a different number of days after madritensis. The results are shown in the graph below. So what I want you to imagine is, we can see these data points on the graph. We start out with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups, so 5 pots. And at the beginning of the experiment, the madritensis seeds were put in each of those similar pots. And at different times, rigidus seeds were also added to the pot. So in the first one at 0 days, rigidus is added. In the second pot at 11 days, rigidus is added, and so on, maybe 22 days, 25, and 30 days, all right? So given that the total dry mass of plant material, now that would be at the end of the 30 days, they measured the total mass, the biomass of the grasses that had grown. So given that the total dry mass of the plant material was the same in each pot, summarize the main conclusions that can be drawn from this investigation. Suggest an explanation for the results when the delay before sowing rigidus was 30 days. So think about that question. Suggest an explanation for the results when the delay for sowing rigidus was 30 days. And I want you to go ahead and answer the question that pops up now. All right, so you've answered the question, and let's just discuss this. So what I want you to see as you look at this graph is on the y-axis, we have the percentage, the final percentage of madritensis after 45 days. So initially, when rigidus is planted at the same time, which one outcompetes the other? And the answer in this first group is the the rigidus. About almost 80% of the final dry mass would be the rigidus species, where only a little over 20% is madritensis. So in the first group, rigidus wins the competition. In the second group, madritensis makes up 40%, which means rigidus makes up 60%. And what we see happening here is we waited 10 days before adding the rigidus. So really, we've given madritensis a 10-day head start. And that's why madritensis does better. If we give madritensis a 20-day head start, now madritensis is going to outcompete rigidus. And if we give it a 30-day head start, it's going to almost completely exclude Rigidus from the pots. Right? So hopefully that kind of gives you a good example and an understanding of how uh, different species are competing in an ecosystem. And when there's competition, one is always going to be excluded or pushed out. Okay, let's go on and talk about trophic structure. So when you hear the term trophic, I want you to think of the terms we've already learned, and that would be heterotrophs and autotrophs. Troph refers to feeding, and so a heterotroph is other feeding. It has to get its food from another place, where an autotroph is self-feeding. It makes its own food. So the trophic structure of an ecosystem then would be the feeding relationships that are found within that ecosystem or within the community. Remember, community is all the living organisms in an ecosystem. So when we talk about trophic structure, we're looking at feeding relationships. Now, there's two ways that we represent or model the feeding relationships within an ecosystem. The first is by using food chains, and these are useful, but they're very simple. And what the food chain does is it organizes uh, it organizes the organisms from starting with producers, plants, and moving up to the top carnivores. And so we can see the flow of energy or the flow of food through that ecosystem. In this food chain, we also have a group of fungi, which are decomposers. And so when this top carnivore dies, its biomass can be decomposed by the fungi, the detritivores or decomposers, and the nutrients go back into the soil. One thing I want to point out here is that actually these detritivores, these fungi, can break down or digest any of these organisms when they die, including the plant life. All right. Okay, so that's one way of representing the trophic relationships within a ecosystem. And here's another example. Sorry, and actually, I want to look at this because I want to ask you a question. We can see the flow of energy or the movement of food through this food chain. What I want you to think about here is we see that the arrow is representing the total amount of energy available to that group. And what's happening is that arrow gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you move through the food chain. Think about why would that be? What's the reason that we have less and less available energy as we move through the food chain? All right. The answer is that at each trophic level, these organisms they're taking in energy and they're using that energy to create biomass, which can be available for the next trophic level, but they're also metabolizing and just using energy to stay alive. And so at each trophic level, energy is being lost to the environment, especially through heat. We'll talk about that more in another lecture. Okay, so a more complex way of representing the trophic relationships within a food chain, within a ecosystem, is called a food web. And this gives us a little bit more accurate perspective of what's going on. And the reason for that is, if you think about it, we know that there's not very many organisms that only eat one specific food. Most organisms will eat multiple species of food as food. So Food Web does a better job of showing that. So let's look at a little bit more specific example. Here we have an Antarctic food web, and we see at the base we have phytoplankton. Phyto means plant, and so these are photosynthetic organisms that are the producers, and they in turn can be eaten by krill or copepods, and so their energy flows to the next trophic level. But as we go, you see there's many different pathways that you could follow moving through this food web. And so this is a more accurate representation of an ecosystem. Now, this is actually probably a vast oversimplification of this particular food web. Another more accurate food web would be something like this, where you have many species shown, many feeding relationships shown, to the point that it's almost hard to make any sense of it because there's so much information here. But the couple things that I want you to notice is when there's a lot of complexity in a food web, if one of these species was to go extinct, this this ecosystem would still be stable, because if we removed the mackerel, right, the organisms that feed on mackerel are going to have other foods that they could eat instead. And so the ecosystem that is complex, and when there's redundancy, like we see in these multiple arrows, this leads to stability. And that kind of flows right into our next concept, which is biodiversity. So in that previous food web that we saw, there's a great variety of organisms that make up the community in that marine food web. And when there's a high level of biodiversity, there's stability. If one species disappears, the ecosystem will not crash. And so biodiversity can be seen on the picture on the left here, the tropical rainforest, high level of biodiversity. This is a very stable environment. On the other hand, you have this pine forest, which is just made up of a single species. It's a monoculture. And if there would be a virus or a disease that affected these trees, it could wipe out the entire forest. There's actually an example of this I'll just mention quickly. There's a species of beetle called the pine sawyer beetle that's really devastating many pine forests around the world. I know in Japan, this has been a big problem. In the United States, it's been a big problem. And these beetles will burrow in, they'll make little holes into the tree, and they'll lay their eggs, and then the eggs will hatch. And the next generation will move on and possibly infect another tree. Shouldn't use the term infect. Will make its home in another tree. Now, the beetle itself isn't killing the tree. It's just making a little hole. What the problem comes is that there's a nematode. If you remember what a nematode is, remember roundworm. There's a nematode that's carried by these pine sawyer beetles, and the nematode actually will damage the xylem of the trees. And so what happens is when the xylem is damaged, it'd be like when you're trying to suck water up a perforated straw. If there's a bunch of holes in your straw, you can't get suction. And so this results in something called pine wilt, where the trees will start browning at the top, and then it works its way down and they die pretty quickly. All right, so this is because, and this spreads because there's monocultures. If there was a great amount of diversity, it would be harder for that nematode to spread. Okay, a keystone species. We're going to look at two examples of species that have a really significant impact on their ecosystem. First is a keystone species, and we describe these as species that exert stronger than expected influence on their ecosystem. So based on their numbers within the ecosystem, we wouldn't necessarily expect them to be extremely important. However, when they're removed, we see that major changes to the ecosystem will occur. And the purple sea star here is an example of a keystone species. And the video that you're going to watch is about a study by a really well-known ecologist named Robert Payne, who went and removed sea stars from these shoreline environments. And I want you to pay attention when you watch that video, what happens to the mussel populations. And it was through this study that Robert Payne really introduced this concept of the keystone species. All right, let's actually take a look at a graph here of the data from Robert Payne's study. So the question is Pisaster, that's the purple sea star, is Pisaster a keystone predator? And I want you to look at the graph, and I want you to answer this question. According to the graph, how did the removal of Pisaster affect the ecosystem? So think about that. All right, and you've answered the question. So let's take a look at the data. And this data was collected over about a 10-year span. When Pisaster remained in the ecosystem, look at the biodiversity or the number of species present. It stays pretty high. But when Pisaster is removed, the biodiversity decreases steadily to a level of about 1. And you'll understand that much better after you watch the other video. All right, so the answer would be yes in this case. Here's another example of a keystone species, the beaver, which is also could be referred to as an ecosystem engineer. They really change their ecosystems and produce these wetland environments where increased fish populations and bird populations can be found. They become much more biodiverse areas because of the presence of the beavers. Okay, let's look at one more type of species that has a significant impact, and that would be what we call invasive species. All right, so an invasive species is one that usually has been transported from one ecosystem to another by humans. And this normally doesn't have much of an impact. Usually a species that is introduced to a new environment is not going to compete very well in that new environment, and as a result of that, they'll just die out. However, occasionally the new environment will be well suited to the species that's been introduced, and if the introduced species doesn't have predators in that new environment, its populations can grow extremely rapidly, and they can have a significant impact on the ecosystem because of that. So let's look at a couple examples of invasive species specific to Thailand. So the first is the water hyacinth. And I've read about these. The history of these is, I think, fairly well established. In the early 1900s, part of the royal family under the Rama V monarchy brought these water hyacinth to Bangkok from Indonesia, and they put these in like pools in the royal palace. And the way the story goes is that probably due to flooding, some of these water hyacinth escaped from the pools, got into the klongs, and then from there into the river, and they have just spread really rapidly. They grow and reproduce very rapidly, and so people have been trying to control their populations, remove these from the river systems of Thailand, because they just kind of clog up the river. Not only do they disrupt transportation, but they also form these large mats that block sunlight. And so other plant species that live within the waterways end up dying, and then the oxygen levels within the waterways is going to decrease, and fish species are going to die out as well. So they have a pretty negative effect on the ecosystem. There's a lot of things that Thais have done in order to kind of use these water hyacinths. So a lot of basket making comes from dried water hyacinth. They've been used as fertilizers and fuel for cooking, probably other things as well, but they still continue to be a problem. Two other examples as we wrap it up for today. One is the common myna, which is the bird on the bottom, a bird you're probably well familiar with because they're very common. But these are pretty aggressive birds, and as they've established themselves outside of their native habitats, they really kind of push out a lot of the native bird species. And the last is the common mealybug, this little pink bug here. Looks so tiny and harmless, but it has had a huge impact, negative impact on the cassava plants that are a major product of Southeast Asia. And I believe Thailand, at least at some point in the recent past, has been, maybe still is, the world's leading producer of cassava. So these mealybugs have really had a negative impact on the cassava crops. And so in Thailand, I think this was back in around 2010, 2011, the idea was to import this parasitic wasp, Alopecia, which I believe is from South America. And these wasps actually specifically target the mealybugs when they lay their eggs. You can see this female is inserting her eggs into the mealybugs, and as those eggs hatch and the larvae develop, the mealybugs die. So the idea is bringing in these wasps as a way to control the population of the mealybugs. And from what I've read, it seems like been a pretty effective way of treating them. You can see here there's a picture of these wasps being introduced. And you can see this the time of this photo is somewhat dated by the type of cameras that are being used. Nobody uses these cameras anymore. Everybody would have their cell phones out now. But I think this took place in around 2010, 2011. All right, so we'll stop here. And as always, feel free to stop by during office hours if you have any questions. Have a great day.